What's up guys, I'm BTC. For a while the character of Moira has caused a little bit of trouble because of how easy the character is to use versus how effective she can be. Today we're going to take an in-depth look at the problems surrounding this hero as well as some potential changes with a rework. I would greatly appreciate it if you like and share the video to help it get some traction, so let's get started. Current problems for Moira. Often you'll hear players say things like, the hero is overpowered, or the hero is not fun to play against, but that sort of feedback is much too vague and largely useless as it doesn't describe the actual issues. So let's get more specific and go into detail about the specific issues with Moira. Number 1. The skill requirement is quite low to achieve maximum effectiveness. What this means is that there is not a great deal of ability management, accuracy, or even situational awareness required in order to provide a large amount of benefit to both yourself and your team. Some examples: Moira's healing and damage are incredibly easy to use, the orbs pretty much do their own thing, and if you ever find yourself in trouble, as long as Fade is available, then Moira will be able to escape. Number 2. Moira has no utility and only provides raw healing and damage. I don't think it's necessary for DPS characters to have utility, but both tank and support probably should, at least in some small form. But Moira doesn't have any of that. No buffs, no debuffs, no CC, none of it. Just healing and damage. I'd like to point out that from a character and lore perspective, only damage and healing doesn't make a lot of sense for Moira. She's a scientist who's all about experimenting, modifying, and doing new things that other people are afraid to or unwilling to do. To me, it sounds like a character that would use lots of different status effects on both teammates and enemies. Anyone can provide simple healing and damage, but Moira is about doing that extra thing. That leads to the next problem, which is number 3. Moira is the only support in the game that has a pure damage ability that incentivizes DPS-like behavior. The purple biotic orb provides only damage and nothing else. At least other abilities like Brigida's Whip Shot will provide knockback and healing in addition to the damage. Mercy has damage amp and Zenyatta has the Orb of Discord, but those don't provide damage directly. They provide a buff or a debuff that allow for the opportunity to deal extra damage. The purple orb benefits no one. It doesn't even recharge Moira's healing resource meter. Sure, it helps her build her ultimate, but in that case, it's functioning just like any other DPS attack ability. Whether it's Soldier's Helix, Doomfist's Punch, or Hanzo's Storm Arrows, it's just damage. Is it no wonder why you have players who choose to use Moira as some kind of a DPS character? And number 4, Moira's abilities allow for a very relaxed sort of autopilot style of gameplay. This goes hand in hand with what I said with the number 1 problem. The Fade is used primarily as a reaction ability, so Moira just waits until she's in danger and then activates it to escape. You don't need to think about it all that much. But the bigger issue is with the biotic orbs. These have a kind of mind of their own. You don't need to pay attention to them or even follow them in any way. Every 10 seconds, throw one of the orbs, and the orb will bounce around either healing or dealing damage all on its own. It doesn't need any further input from the player, and even if it's completely ignored, it will still go and do its own thing. This would be less of an issue if the orb stayed in one spot, like a turret, the immortality field, or many other abilities, but the orbs move around and often end up quite far away from where they were originally tossed. You can save a teammate or get an elimination that you never even intended or knew about, but it did because the orb just happened to bounce the correct way. And also, this starts to look a little bit too much like RNG, and that's really bad. I don't believe that Moira can be solved by simply adjusting some numbers through buffs and nerfs. There seems to be fundamental problems with how the character works in regard to the problems that I listed. If there are going to be changes, then let's talk about some of the goals that we would want for those changes. Number 1. Maintaining the ease of access and overall feel for the average player. I don't want to add new abilities that require all new animations. This would add a whole lot of extra work on Blizzard's part, and it would just change too much of the character. I want to keep what is already there, but change the function enough so that it works better. Blizzard has repeatedly stated that they do not want every character to require incredible aim. They want a variety of methods to attack, and that the game should be available to a wider player base that that may have not have spent years in a game like CSGO. Having said that, however, Moira's method of dealing damage is still probably a little too much on the easy side. And that leads into number 2, increasing the skill required to achieve the maximum effectiveness. There needs to be more follow-up, better ability and resource management, and a change to way how her attack works. There absolutely is a way to keep Moira accessible to the larger player base while also requiring more skill to use the character at peak performance, which I'll discuss more in just a minute. Goal number 3. Add utility and teamwork potential. As I said, Moira only provides healing and damage, which feels a little uncharacteristic of her. From a gameplay standpoint, adding more functionality will automatically raise the total skill requirement to hit that maximum effectiveness. It also creates more unique synergies among teammates. So after identifying the problems and establishing our goals, let's take a look at the rework that I've designed. As always, this is just a starting point as it would require a bit of testing to make sure that everything works properly. On the left-hand side, you will see the current version, and on the right-hand side will be the rework version, all those numbers, and the symbols on the screen will also help you identify what those changes are, whether it's a nerf, buff, or unchanged. To start, Moira's primary healing is unchanged. The healing per second, range, extra heal over time, resource meter, all that stuff would function the same as it does currently. However, moving on to damage, this is quite different from how it currently works. First is that the damage per second has been reduced from 50 down to 40, and hold on, I know some of you are thinking Blizzard just tried this on the experimental mode and they didn't like it. Yes, that's true, but they only changed the damage value, and I'm changing a lot more than that, and therefore this reduction is necessary, and you'll see why in a second. Next is the lifesteal from the attack that has been reduced from 20 down to 15, and it should be noted that Moira's lifesteal is a flat number and not based on how much damage she's doing. Again, this is necessary, and that is because of the next two changes. Moira's attack has gone from single to multiple target, and the range has been significantly reduced from 20 meters down to 14 meters. Specifically, what I'm suggesting here is getting rid of Moira's current method of attack and replacing it with something that would function similar to how Moira's healing and Mei's primary attack will work. So this would change how the hits are registered on the enemies. Let me show you what I'm talking about. In this chart, you can see Winston's attack, which is in this cone out in front of him. It's 8 meters in range and about 6 meters wide towards the outermost part. However, something like Mei's attack is a straight line. Mei's attack has a 10-meter range and is 1 meter wide the entire length. Moira's healing is the same thing, except it's 15-meter range and 1.5 meter wide. Now, if we take a look at Moira's old attack, it has a range of 20 meters, and for reference, Zarya's attack is 15 meters and Symmetra's attack is 12 meters. However, they do considerably more damage with their attacks, so that makes sense for them to be shorter. I'm not going to go into detail on the differences between these attacks and how they register hits and all that sort of stuff, because it's not necessary for this video, but again, Blizzard knows what I'm talking about, and I'm suggesting that we get rid of Moira's current attack method and instead replace it with something similar to how her heal works and how Mei's attack works. This new attack would have a 14-meter range at 1 meter wide, and there are 3 major effects of this change. The first is that this method would be more difficult than Moira's current or the old method of attack. I'm not going to pretend that it requires a great deal of accuracy for Mei to hit an enemy with her primary attack, but it certainly requires more than what Moira currently needs to do with her attack. So while this isn't going to make Moira require a massive amount of accuracy, it will make it a little bit more difficult to apply constant damage to enemies. The second really big change is that Moira's attack would now be able to hit multiple targets. This required several trade-offs. Because Moira can hit several enemies at once, it could not possibly stay at the same range of 20 meters. That would be way too powerful. That needed to be reduced, along with the damage and the lifesteal. I didn't include the charts, but being able to hit multiple targets would also mean that Moira would be able to recharge her healing resource meter much faster than before. There may need to be other adjustments in order to properly balance this sort of thing, because you don't want her refilling the meter just constantly and very quickly all the time. That would be too strong, so testing on this sort of thing would be required. But in general, she would be able to refill her healing resource a little faster than she currently does. The changes to Moira's attack essentially boil down to this. It feels the same as it currently does, with a very similar style of player tracking where you have to follow the enemy around. Hitting the enemy, however, requires slightly better accuracy and tracking skill. The attack is still going to be effective against smaller and faster moving targets, and while it does lose some damage and range, it also gains the ability to hit multiple targets. But now let's move on to the abilities. The first one is Fade. Nothing has changed here. Everything is the same as it is on the current version. But moving on to the Biotic Orbs, this is where we're going to get another very significant change to Moira. The idea is to make it so that the orbs provide more than just healing and damage. They will now require that the player pay attention to them and to follow up. Let's go through the details. The speed of the orbs is unchanged. The duration has been reduced from 7 seconds down to 5.5 seconds. However, the cooldown has also been reduced from 10 seconds down to 8 seconds. But here is where the really big change happens. The orbs will no longer provide healing and damage. Instead, Biotic Orbs place a heal buff or an anti-heal debuff on players that are tethered. Initial effects start at 20% and increase by 20% as long as the orb is tethered to the player, up to a maximum of 60%. The effect will persist for 2 seconds after the tether breaks. There are a few really important things that I need to point out about this. The first is that despite the orb itself having a full duration of 5.5 seconds, the average time a player can expect to have one of these status effects on them is between 3 and 5 seconds, which is comparable to many other abilities. If you look at this example, throwing the orb, the enemy is tethered for just barely over 1 second. So if you add in the extra 2 seconds, it brings it up to only 3 seconds total. Now, obviously, players are going to be moving around. Sometimes it might be a little less, sometimes it might be a little more, but I need to emphasize in the vast majority of circumstances, it is extremely unlikely that any player will get the status effect for the entire duration because of how quickly the orbs move around. Sure, it can happen if the players are in a very small room, but even then, objects or a slight angle on the wall can cause the orb to fly off and you won't get the full duration. And the second thing, if we go back to that other screen, you'll notice that the 5.5 second duration plus the 2 seconds of the extra effect only adds up to 7.5 seconds. But the cooldown is 8 seconds. And this means that it is impossible to chain the orbs together to keep the maximum 60% effect. It will reset every single time, no matter what. Those numbers were specifically chosen to make it so that you can't chain them. What these changes do is make it so that the Biotic Orbs are no longer just an autopilot ability. You can't simply toss them out and forget about them. The Moira player and her team need to follow up. It's kind of like Zenyatta putting the Orb of Discord on an enemy. By itself, it does nothing until someone on your team actually lands a hit on that enemy. So in the case of Moira, the bonus healing on your team is worthless if you're not actually healing them. And the anti-heal is also worthless unless your team is actually pressuring that enemy. The new yellow orb now allows Moira to synergize and provide some utility to her team and the other healer. The new purple orb allows Moira to partially counter area effect healing and also force the enemy to think a little bit more about their positioning. On the current version of Moira, there isn't a whole lot of decision making when it comes to using the Biotic Orbs. The player just tosses it out whenever it's off cooldown. But with these new versions, the player needs to be more mindful of not only when to use the orb, but also which one, because both of them now provide a very useful utility. I did think about other potential status effects for the orbs, but keep in mind that one is yellow and one is purple, which is generally associated with healing and damage or anti-heal. If I wanted to have some sort of movement speed, then you would probably need to change it to a green, or if you wanted to have it do damage boost, then it would have to be blue. And while it's possible that Blizzard could make these changes, it doesn't really fit with the character because she already has the primary healing, which is yellow, and the primary damage, which is purple. So it just kind of made sense to keep it where it was. Moving on to Moira's ultimate ability, just like with Fade, I didn't really see a lot of reason to make changes. Sure, you might have to change how fast the ultimate charges, but for the most part, I think it's fine the way it is. However, there is one other thing that I wanted to change with Moira. I've mentioned before that I think every character should have a passive ability. I made a full video on it. But without going into too much of it here, I believe that it's a way to better balance and fine-tune the characters without having to worry about adding extra buttons, specifically for new abilities, which is something that is simply impossible for console versions of the game. I've spent a good deal of time trying to come up with something that would work for Moira, something that would go along with her risky experimental style, and then I suddenly thought of it.
I take risks that others would consider to be unwise.
Moira's passive is called Taking Risks. Pressing reload, a button that she currently doesn't need, will deal 75 damage to Moira, but will refill her biotic resource meter. This can only be used when Moira's health is above 90%. There are 4 or 5 different versions of this passive that I have written down elsewhere. Instead of being instant damage, maybe it's a slow drain, or maybe you could change the amount, but I needed to pick something in order to put it here, so I just went with this one. But in all honesty, this is absolutely something that would need to be tested thoroughly in order to find out which version of this passive would work. But I think the general idea is still a good one. Essentially, Moira causing the experiment to deal a little bit of damage, but she gets a benefit out of it. Because if you remember, one of the first people that Moira was experimenting on was herself. So it makes sense that she would be willing to do this sort of thing. I also like the fact that this ability raises the skill requirement for the hero. You don't have to use it. In fact, I would expect that many players in the lower bracket ranks probably wouldn't use it all that much at all. But the higher skill players would probably be using it quite often. And in a way, this button still makes a lot of sense because even though it has nothing to do with your attack, it's still refilling your resource meter. Now let's say that all this stuff went in. What are the effects on the game if these changes happened? Well, I think that Moira would still be a very popular character in the lower bracket. I think that she would still be very accessible to new players or those that are just in general unfamiliar with other types of FPS games like CSGO. However, the change in the attack would make it a little bit more challenging to constantly deal damage. Even if your tracking is pretty bad, you're still going to be able to hit the enemy, but you won't be able to do the constant damage that Moira currently is able to. This combined with the nerf to the distance and the change to the purple biotic orb means that DPS Moira would pretty much go away. I think most people would give up on it very quickly when they notice just how incredibly ineffective the DPS Moira is with this new version. Not saying that nobody would try it, but I think for the most part it's going away. The biotic orb changes add more utility and also require the player to pay more attention and to follow up instead of simply tossing them out and forgetting. This means that the skill requirement of the character again goes up a little bit more. You can just toss the orb out towards your teammates and it's going to be effective, but being able to better manage when to use those orbs and which one to use and where to throw them is going to have a much bigger impact with the new version than it ever did with the old version. I think this rework version of Moira still adheres to a lot of the basic design that Blizzard wants to have for the character while also resolving the problems that Moira has. And as always, I don't think for even a second that Blizzard would ever use my ideas, but perhaps some of the feedback on the existing problems they might find useful. So what do you think about the changes, or do you have any ideas on your own? Let me know down below. And if you haven't done so yet, please take a second to hit the like button and share the video. Thanks for watching, and if you'd like to be comment of the video, then leave yours, and while you're at it, ring the bell so you never miss a new video. Also, if you want to get some cool gear, join my Discord server, or follow me on social media, then check out the links down below. And remember, always blame the controller, because it's never your fault.